Hello folks, welcome back. Today I want to address a question that I get fairly often, and that is, how do I learn about my pocket watch? Pocket watches fall in roughly two different main categories: American watches and European watches. Today's video is going to be about American watches. We'll do another video soon on European watches. So I have a selection of watches here. You've probably heard of the main brands of watches. We have Hamilton, Waltham, Elgin, Illinois, Hampden, Howard, and a few others. And we can get a lot of information just by looking at the dial. This one says Waltham. This one says Hamilton. We have a Howard over here. This is a Hampton and an Elgin. And many of these brands should be familiar to you if you've done any work learning about watches. But this one doesn't say anything at all. And this one says Washington Watch Company, and I've never heard of that before. Most of the real information lies on the movement itself, and to access that we need to know how to open our watch. I've done a longer video on this that you should refer to, but for just a quick review, many watches just have a screw back. You can see there's a seam, and then you just unscrew it like this, and that reveals the movement. Some of them have cases that open on the back in a flip method, and we can usually see that there's some kind of hinge. That's our clue that this opens this way. And then there is usually a dust cover in the middle. This watch is a little tired, so this dust cover is actually missing its hinge pin. But there we have our movement on this watch. And some we actually access through the front, unscrewing the bezel like we did the back of the other watch, and we can see there's a little thumbnail detent there. To access this, we're going to pull the crown up and stick our thumbnail in, being very careful to not touch the hands on the dial, and then we can see our movement there. Before we get started, I want to say that this movement is extremely fragile, and I want to advise you to be very careful to not touch anything in the movement or in the unprotected dial here. Make sure you're not pushing hands in with fingers, that kind of thing. Only grab the watch by the edges, the outside of the case. One other note, you will see a lot of information in the watch case back as well. And this information relates to the case of the watch, not the movement of the watch. And so for the most part, we're going to ignore this information. Just while we are here, this is a Howard watch. This is actually what's called a Keystone Howard watch, which is a later Howard watch. And the Keystone Watch Case Company, which we see made this case, actually purchased the Howard Watch Company and put this together. But we're going to ignore this information because, again, it has to do with the case, not the watch movement. The watch movement, they vary a little bit in how much information that they present, but there's a lot of stuff here, and we're going to talk through this. First of all, just pointing out some features of this watch. This is a beautiful watch. We've got a bunch of ruby jewels here, which really stand out. This is one of the reasons I love pocket watches so much, is they're big enough to appreciate. They're old. This mechanical artistry is not something that was made in modern times. People figured out how to do this micro machining 150, 200 years ago, and that just impresses the heck out of me. So if we look at the markings of this watch, we see here Howard Watch Company. There's again the brand. We have our city. We have a symbol. Up here at the top, we see 21 jewels right there. And so these red things are the jewels. I did a walkthrough of a watch where I kind of explained where the jewels are. The main purpose of a jewel is to increase the running lifespan of a watch like this. It's possible to make a watch that runs with as few as 7 jewels, but generally speaking, the more jewels a watch has, the more desirable it is and more longer lasting. We see our balance wheel down here, and we see this little black coil. That is the hairspring of the watch. This horseshoe thing is the return spring for the regulation lever of the watch, and this is this straight piece of metal in the middle of the horseshoe. And the screw on this side of the horseshoe that goes in this direction is what you adjust to make very fine changes in the rate of a watch. This being a railroad watch, that's why it has some of these features. Also, while we're in here, arguably the most important thing is the serial number. And we can see that right here. This watch is 1279030. and we're going to use something called the PocketWatchDatabase.com to get even more information about this. Here is our Waltham that we looked at a minute ago. This is what's called a sidewinder because you wind it on the side. And here's our movement. This has got some plate decoration that's kind of neat. There's some engine turning, and this has also got some gold markings on here which really decorate it. This is called a full plate movement, meaning basically everything is all in one big plate. The first watch that we looked at had a bunch of bridges, so it's a more modular watch. This is an older style, and they're a little bit more difficult to put together. Here again we see 21 joules up here. We see Vanguard, which is the series name of this watch, Waltham, Massachusetts. And again, we have our serial number on this side. Again, I'm being very careful to only touch the outside of the watch. This one is 105-32183. While we're here, this is a star regulator style watch. And so to adjust the rate of this, here we see slow and we see fast over here, and there's this star in the middle. That star has a pinion and then this rack that adjusts the balance adjuster, and that's got very fine teeth on it. And again, this is a railroad watch that's a little earlier than the first one that we looked at, but great watch in an earlier style. If we look at this guy, this is a silver case watch that's fairly tarnished here, and this was the one that we had no dial markings at all. This is just a preview of something else, but we can see some silver markings here, and this is an indication that this is actually a silver watch rather than just a base metal watch, which obviously makes it more valuable. And if we look at the back of this guy, we see seemingly there's less going on. This is, again, pretty much a full plate watch, and this yellow finish is called gilt. And we see AM Watch Company. We see Riverside, Waltham, Massachusetts. So this is a predecessor to a Waltham watch. We'll see that again. And we get some other information here. We have something called a safety pinion, and that's a mechanism that hopes to protect your watch from being destroyed if your mainspring breaks. And then we see the word adjusted. I did a longer explanation on what some of these features mean. Adjusted generally means that there was some factor that they considered to try to compensate for. Some of the adjustments are positional. You can have dial up, crown down, dial down, etc. And in every one of these positions, all of the watch parts ride on each other slightly differently, and that can actually affect the rate of the watch. You can also adjust for temperature and isochronism, which is how the watch performs when it's fully wound versus when it's not as fully wound. And so a watch that's adjusted versus a watch that is not adjusted may not actually have a lot of different parts. The difference is the labor that was put in to set the watch up so it runs well in many situations, and that's going to translate toward better timekeeping. But again, what we're looking for here is the brand name of the watch, and we're looking for our serial number of the watch, this guy 2877832. We've got a little guy. This is a Hunter case pendant watch. And again, fancy back. We open the back. This has got an onion paper, which is kind of fun. This was put in either by the original retailer or by someone who serviced the watch. By the way, whatever details come with a watch like this, be sure to keep those because that's part of the history of the watch and makes them more valuable. Again, we have our inside dust cover, and here we have another gilt colored watch. We see Hampton Watch Company, and we have a little bit simpler regulator system. This is not a railroad watch, this is just a general purpose watch. And again, we have our serial number. A minute ago, I mentioned a Washington Watch Company watch. This one is a screwback watch, like many of them are. And I wanted to show this off because this is kind of an interesting thing here. This is what's called a private label watch. It says Washington Watch Company, and it says a Senate as the series name. We see at the top here that it has 17 joules. We see a serial number, and then we see adjusted. Now, I happen to know, based on experience with watches, that this is actually an Illinois watch. This shape of this bridge right here is a very Illinois-like feature. And companies did this a lot. They wanted to have a watch that was branded for their particular store. In Minneapolis here, there are companies like J.B. Hudson that did that over the decades. And it could be small jewelers, large jewelers. And if you were a dealer and you ordered enough watches, people would be willing to put their name, in this case, both on the dial and on the movement plate itself. Others of these are maybe a little bit less costly private labels where they marked the dial, but you would actually see Illinois on the back of a watch like this. So armed with the brand and armed with the serial number, now we can go over to Pocket Watch Database and we can get a lot more information about our watches. Welcome to PocketWatchDatabase.com. Full disclosure, I am not affiliated with the site in any way. However, I use this site and I fully support the work that they do. I would recommend joining and supporting their database work if you can. They have a how to look up my pocket watch guide here. You're welcome to take a look at that. We're going to walk through this together. And there's two main fields that we need. We need our movement serial number, and then we need to drop down a manufacturer. And the reason we need both fields is because Hamilton serial number 1234567 and Waltham serial number 1234567 are going to be different watches. So let's start with the first watch that we looked at, which is this Howard with a swing out case. We are going to type in the serial number of that watch, which is 1279030, and as I mentioned, this is a Howard. Now, you'll see here that there's E. Howard & Co. and E. Howard Keystone. The good news is if something doesn't work out the way that you expect here, you can just try again. I happen to know, based on the case markings and some other information, this is a E. Howard Keystone watch, a later Howard watch. So let's see what comes up. Okay, here is our detail page. We see a diagram of the movement here. We see that this is a grade Series 10 watch, so grade is like the model line. We see E. Howard Watch Company, Waltham, Massachusetts, our movement serial number, and here is our estimated production year. So this was 1914. This was of a run of 2,000 of these identical watches, and we can see that they made about 18,000 of these. This is a 16 size watch. Sometime we'll talk about that in more detail. I did cover this in a couple of the watch videos I've done previously. We see 21 jewels, that it is open face. It has a nickel plated finish rather than gilt, and some other details here. This movement setting, this is how we set the time on the watch. This is a lever set watch. So we pull out the little lever in this watch's case, between the 1 and the 2, and then the crown turns the hands. And we have all these other pieces of information about the watch. Double roller relates to the jewel configuration at the impulse pallets and the escape wheel, the method of the mainspring, the regulator type, the hairspring style, and then here is some of our adjusted information. So this says it is adjusted at some point, and it is adjusted to position, and in more detail, 5 different positions. Sometimes they would adjust to 3 positions or just 1 position. This is also adjusted to temperature, isochronism, and this is one a lot of people are interested in. Is this a railroad grade watch or not? I did a whole video on what makes a railroad grade watch. This one is a railroad grade watch. So this information is very helpful in determining what you have and the level of quality and to some degree the amount of rarity of your watch. There are ways to get some value estimate through the website if you are a paying member here. But even the information that we get for free is very interesting. Let's move on to our next watch. This is the Waltham Vanguard. So I'm going to go to the top of the page here, and we're going to change this to Waltham, and we're going to type in our movement serial number, 1053218 and we're going to hit the search button. And here we are. We see Waltham. Here's our movement serial number. This is a model 1892, production year 1901. So by the way, this looks like a year, this model 1892, and that's basically what it was. This watch was made, the watch movement style was designed in 1892 and ran for some number of years after this. They made 300 of these in a run, but they made 101,000 of these. This is an 18 size watch, which is larger than the 16 size watch that we looked at earlier. This is also a 21 jewel watch, and we can see that the movement is hunting configuration. That's the more appropriate word for sidewinder, which means that it winds at the 3 o'clock. And again, we have a nickel finish lever set. You'll notice this one does not indicate whether it was a railroad watch or not. I spoke to this to some degree in my What is a Railroad Watch video, and that is, it sort of depends on when the watch was in service as to whether it was a railroad grade watch or not. And in some cases, it just is, there's holes in the pocket watch database system. They got all this information from old catalogs and service records. The NAWCC has been in existence for a long time now, and a lot of this information was actually handed over directly from these manufacturers as the businesses were winding down. And that's where a lot of this information has come from. Some of it's really great. Some of it is maybe a little imperfect. I've actually submitted some corrections based on watches that I have. But this is pretty good, and it does give you a lot of information about this. Okay, let's talk about our Washington watch. This was our private label watch, and we pretty sure that there wasn't a company called Washington Watch that actually made movements, so we want to figure out what this is. If I drop down our list here, you can see that there are some names here that are probably private labels of large companies. And if you can find your maker in here, obviously that's very easy. But if we scroll down here, we don't have a Washington watch option. So if you run into the situation, your best bet is to look up the major companies. Elgin made a massive number of watches. Waltham made a massive number of watches. So start with one of those if you're not seeing your name, and then compare what your movement looks like with this movement diagram if they have one, and that'll get you close. I have a feeling that our Washington watch is actually in Illinois. So we're going to type in Illinois, and then we're going to type in our watch serial number, which is 1748214, and we'll see what comes up. All right, we have Illinois watch grade 64, and if you look at the shape of this diagram, you see what I pointed out earlier, that this is probably a watch. And if we look here, they've actually got some information on that. This says private label Washington Watch Company, Senate, and that's exactly what we have. So again, we have maker Illinois Watch Company, Springfield, Illinois. We have an estimated production year of 1909. We have a run quantity, and this information came right from the manufacturer's records, and they made about 21,000 of these watches. And they would have made them for perhaps themselves, and then in this case, Washington Watch Company. And we have our other pieces of information here, the movement configuration, how you set the watch, some information about the plate, whether it's adjusted or not. This one does actually tell us that it is not a railroad grade watch. And you can watch my video on what is a railroad watch to learn why some watches are and others are not eligible to be railroad grade. I hope this video was helpful in giving you some first steps on finding out about your watch, both how it was made, its quality, its age, and I hope this encourages you to dig further and explore the hobby of collecting watches. Thanks for watching.